Live from our home studios across North America, please welcome the hosts of Security Sidebar, Peter Silva, Sander Vinberg, and a very special guest today, Ray Pompon. Hello, community, and welcome to this month's Security Sidebar. I'm Peter. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We like to talk about technologies, application delivery services, and the what is and how to deploy those types of technologies. So if that's your racket, maybe hit that subscribe button and tag along with us as we go. For those of you returning, welcome once again. We really appreciate your support. We live stream every Tuesday and Thursday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific, along with our many other shows. So come along with us. Before I introduce my guests, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the show. It's community.f5.com, Dev Central. That's right. Get your free membership today and thank our sponsors. You know, applications have become so much part of our lives, where before they used to be these little things we check somewhere along the way, and now they're, ensuring that our pacemakers are working, that our refrigerators and ovens are working, and we rely on applications so much in our day-to-day lives now. And we're going to be talking about F5 Labs Application Protection Report today. And with that, let me bring on my co-hosts for the second Tuesday of the month. Come on down, Sander and Ray.
Hello.
Hello. I practiced that intro like for the 2 days leading up, but it never comes out the way it usually smoothly does, on my morning walks. But welcome anyway, fellas. Good to have you.
You got to figure out how to do this show from your morning walk, like be walking and live.
Ooh. Well, I did kind of start doing the promos from the morning walk just to give a little glimpse into, what we do outside the studio. So the question today is, recently, my daughter's been doing some English, and we've been talking about, there was a story she read recently called, what's it called? Oh, The Sound of Thunder. which is, I believe, a Ray Bradbury one, you know, where
Time
the
travel,
guy,
yes.
yeah, the guy wants to go back in time to shoot a dinosaur, specifically a T-Rex. And so I thought, you know, kind of interesting. Today's question for both of you is, if you could time travel and in only one direction, which way would it be? Would you go back to experience something in history or a distant relative, or would you go forward in time? Now, again, you know, stay on the path, don't touch anything, but I'm just curious if you prefer to go back or go forward. How about you go first, Sander?
I think I would. I gotta admit, I have not given this a ton of thought, but I think I would go backwards to a time like pre-growth of humanity, but like before, but kind of the age of mammals, but before humans covered the earth. You know, because it's like I don't want to go so far back that it's like before the age of flowering plants, and I don't want to get eaten by a dinosaur. And you know, like it so happens we've been reading a lot about ferns lately. There are a lot of ferns around us on the land, and they're crazy primitive plants, and so plant evolution is on my mind at the moment. But so I would just I would like that time when you could roam the land and things were beautiful, and you didn't see a human every 500 yards or closer. But not so far back that the sort of ecology and biology are notably different. So a couple million years back, I think.
And then would you want to stay, or would you want to return to the time? Like, would you want to stay in that time and be literally the first human that somebody discovers, you know, thousands, millions of years later, and they can actually, the first one ever, we call him Sander.
Well, you know, it's funny because I was doing chores yesterday outside, and it was like 38 and rainy, and my hands got super cold, and I tend to get kind of cold hands and feet, and I was just thinking about how in an earlier time I probably would have not have survived super long. You know, I've got asthma and all these other things that like is not exactly what we would think of as like a survival trait, right? So I would stay back there with the cognizance that I would probably die in like a year or two. But it sounds peaceful. It sounds beautiful. Everywhere around me in the Northwest, I see evidence of huge 1,000-year-old trees that have been cut down and will never grow back. You know, right. So I wish I could have seen the old forest, and I wish I could have seen the way things were. So I'd go back, die early, but have a really nice, peaceful time while I was there.
Cool. What about you, Ray?
Well,
as he grimaces on.
Yeah, I was gonna say if it was like a one-way trip, it's like I don't want to leave my family behind. But I think similar to Sander, I'd probably want to go back to like pre-Columbia America.
Oh yeah,
and just wander around and see how things are, because there's so little we actually know, and I'm just really curious. I'd love to like, and the same thing, you know, like see what the land was like in the forests and all that before everything got paved over, and you know, I want to see those giant herds of buffalo and stuff like
domesticated turkeys.
Yeah.
If you're thinking Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. I had kind of thought about it, and at first I thought, yeah, maybe going back, but then it's kind of for me, it was almost like, well, that's already happened. And not to say I want to necessarily live in the future where we're all chipped as we come out of the womb, but I don't know. For me, I think I'd kind of want to go to like 2100 or 2200 to see what potentially will become, and then, you know, probably want to jump off a building at that point.
I was gonna say
that's all AR at the time.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of, I was just like, oh, I'm just, you know, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it Peter, it so happens that Ray and I share a sort of like pessimistic view about a lot of things, human nature included, I think. And so I'm sitting here thinking about what 2100 is going to be like, and I don't know how much I could say without either just being depressing or kind of more political than I think we want to be here. So,
well, in that case, then the application protection report wouldn't become a daily thing or wouldn't become a yearly thing. It would probably become a daily thing where you'd have to put out these bulletins,
right,
on a daily basis. And so with the annual application protection report from F5 Labs, so you want to tell us just a little bit about the genesis of that, Ray, and how it's become the annual report that it has?
Sure. I'd love to tell this story. I mean, this is something that started years ago when I was still fresh at F5 Labs, and F5 Labs was new. And my old boss Preston came to me and said, "Well, I want to do something like I want to create the essentially the Verizon breach report of applications. I want to take like all the data, all the sources you can think, everything you could think is relevant, and talk about application security in a way that CISOs and defenders could look at this and it'd be packed full of info data, but analysis. And so you could look at this and see like everything I need to know about protecting application. And it's just like, what? and at the time we didn't have a lot of data at hand, so we tried a lot. We pulled together a lot of different sources. We did a big Ponemon survey on like what people were doing with their security programs. We had a lot of honeypot data. We worked a lot with our DDoS Silverline group to give us rather detailed pictures. But and this is where we started like, I want to do like the full breach reports. I want to look at breaches that were related to application security. So I remember going through like, all the states attorney generals, they publish all these letters. California was the big one. They had just on their website a ton of like the actual letters that people get mailed when they get breached. And you could read through these things and you if you had some security knowledge, you could really read and go, oh, okay, this is what happened here. And so it was like, I don't have that kind of giant data source, but I have these, and they're pretty representative of what's going on. So I actually was working with a bunch of different universities who were helping me crunch all this data. We also looked at vulnerabilities. We're really trying to like all the data I can get my hands on, how can I crunch this together? And then over time, we've kind of like pared that back and focused more and brought in different data sources. But it was really, it was both a terrible scramble and a heck of a lot of fun to just kind of think about this for the first time and really organize it. And that's when I kind of like handed off to Sander a few years later.
So this is what, the fourth year? Is that right?
It's the fifth.
The fifth year. Okay.
Yeah. The 2020 application protection report, sort of in terms of just like years on the cover of the thing, it sort of got lost in the shuffle. And that was essentially it was a combination of the way that the early pandemic unfolded, the fact that we sort of processed a lot of data at the last minute, and then also the way that the 2019 report sort of came out towards the end of 2019. So what we ended up doing was the 2020 report was almost like a 2019 and a half. So so that's why there's like a second edition, a supplementary thing to the 2019. But this is actually the fifth year that we've done it, because the first one Ray did was 2018.
Got it. Now, we've talked obviously about this. In fact, last week, we kind of introduced it a little bit. You did the session at Agility. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but one of the things initially there was, we were talking about how so let me just take a step back. What were some of the things that didn't surprise you? Like, oh, that's normal. Oh, that happens it's kind of like the typical stuff that you would expect within the report for the 2022 edition.
Yeah. So for the last several years, one of the most sort of reliable findings that we can just sort of always count on is the high frequency of these breaches that we would call access breaches. And it's sort of a strange term, and it comes from the model that Ray developed when Preston and Ray sort of first conceptualized this thing. Ray came up with a way to sort of characterize an application in terms of attack surface, and it's a really, really great model, and it's really, really good for sort of showing how a modern application is different from how we used to think about applications several years ago. And so when we say access breaches, what we're talking about, in short, is stuff like credential stuffing, phishing, brute force, anything that is sort of focusing on an authentication surface. And it can focus either on the person, like a phishing attack, or it can focus on the technical framework, like credential stuffing. And so what you see here, this is 4 years of data breaches broken down by these very sort of general causes. And you can see this bright yellow thing right here. These are the access breaches. And so for 2018, 2019, they made up just about half of the breaches that we knew something about the cause. And sometimes this is just like business email compromise is the only thing that we know about. But if we know that it was just a handful of accounts and not every single account, then we can conclude it's an access breach and not like an email infrastructure breach, right? And so the first thing that surprised us was between 2019 and 2020, access breaches dropped by a lot, by 15%, right? So from 50% to just under 35. And so that happened in concert with sort of the growth in malware. And then the third-party breaches, you can't necessarily tell from this graph, but those are all also ransomware attacks. So last year, access breaches started to kind of take a back seat. This year, we saw the same thing. So access breaches are really not making up as big a proportion of breaches as they were for the last few years. And the flip side of that is, I mean, it's no surprise that ransomware is doing a lot of damage right now. Everybody knows that. We've been discussing it for more than a year. All the other folks that do these kinds of briefings have been discussing that for more than a year as well. But just the kind of growth rate, because we know that there are sort of delays in terms of reporting, and for a trend to show up in the breach disclosures like this means this is what I would consider sort of a lagging indicator about breach trends, right? And so let
me just ask you this real quick. Yeah, could it can you attribute any of that to, say, the whole pandemic and people working from home? So I don't know if that has any play into it at all.
It does, yeah. I mean, the pandemic ushered in this kind of explosion of remote access infrastructure. And a lot of that has, we essentially pushed a lot of authentication out to the edge, which people have been saying we need to do for a long time, but we did it in a hurry, and we didn't necessarily implement it as carefully as if somebody said if I was a security architect and someone came to me and said, we're going to take our entire workforce and push them out remote and everything is going to go through VPN, that would be a project that I would want to take some time and do very carefully. And most organizations, I don't think, had the opportunity to do that. And so that opened up kind of a whole nother raft of access points. It also sort of changed the nature of the traffic. And so if folks were looking for anomalies in terms of traffic in their environments, which not everybody has the maturity to do, but if they were, now they have a whole new set of patterns, right? A lot of folks are accessing mail differently, not working on site, all that sort of thing. And so the sort of the drop in access breaches here, I think, is only part of the story. And I think that there are a couple other things. And this is partly because when we look at this model that Ray developed is really, really great for a lot of reasons, but it also sort of has this risk that we're going to cannibalize findings, right? Because the fact is we could have an access breach. We could have an attack that starts with an access breach and then ends with ransomware. And so when we have to choose between malware and access, that's actually one of the reasons why this report uses so many different data models to sort of tease out these different findings. Because what we find and what we've found from talking with other security experts is kind of depending on the angle that you approach information security, you can end up with some different conclusions and different strategies. And it is really important to sort of look at the big picture to the greatest degree possible. Otherwise, you can end up sort of characterizing risk in ways that I don't think are accurate.
I was going to say, I didn't mention this either, but because this is an entire conference talk that I've given, but the data modeling we had to come up with for the first App Protect report was a project, a multidiscipline, multi-month project that it was just like, oh my God, just trying to, and it does come back to the question like, well, what answer are you trying to solve for?
Yeah.
And I think we always try to fall back on the what did defenders need to know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think then when, if from a sort of like philosophical or epistemology standpoint, we'd be looking at this thing and be like, well, these are apples to oranges, and malware and credential stuffing not even in the same ballpark. But in terms of kind of what is the kind of attack that attackers should be, or that defenders really need to be responding to and mitigating against, it still ends up sort of boiling down things in a more practical form. And so to kind of, Peter, I feel like I'm rambling here, but to kind of bring it back to your original question about surprises, within kind of this data model view, I was surprised that access hadn't grown back after 2020, and I was also surprised to see that malware in this model made up about 30% of the breaches that we looked at last year, which is almost double what we saw in 2020. And in 2020, that was almost triple what we saw in 2019, right? And so you see numbers float around. People say like ransomware infections are up 1,000%, and the number is always going to be dependent on the specific data model and the definitions and the assumptions. But any way you cut it, this represents a sort of a sea change, right? Like I would consider this a change in an era for information security primarily because fighting against ransomware sort of requires that you really have all your bases covered, because there's so many different ways to get in and deploy ransomware.
So one of the things that you had mentioned, I believe, last year, or at least in years past, I don't know if everybody heard me bang the mic, but was that there came a point, particularly with ransomware, where, and correct me if I'm not describing this accurately, but a lot of times bad guys, steal data, PII, credit cards, whatever, to then, sell on the dark web and make their money that way. But then there were instances where with the ransomware, the data itself wasn't necessarily valuable to all the riffraff out there looking to make a quick buck. It was literally or really only valuable to the company itself. So rather than selling it on the dark market, you ransom up the company because they're the only ones that are going to pay for it anyway.
Yeah.
And I believe we were talking just last week that now, and even with ransomware, the whole monetization has sort of shifted back into the kind of anyone who'll buy it, I'll sell it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was a realization that we had last year, and it had to do with sort of a pattern that we saw between how organizations are being breached and what kind of data they process. And if you could actually bring another graph up, Peter, there's something else here that I think will illustrate it faster than me just talking. So if you see here, this is the breach causes broken down by sectors for 2021. So this is the data that we just processed. The distribution here is pretty similar to what we saw last year. And this is really the kicker, is that the only sector that has a high incidence of web exploits is the retail industry. And those exploits, the vast majority of the web exploits that we see in this kind of data, because the big stuff like Accellion and Log4j, those web exploits don't tend to surface in these breach disclosures because they don't always leak customer data. So the stuff that we see is almost all like Magecart style stuff. Right. So this is a very sort of efficient, light touch attack and is extremely good at harvesting credit card numbers. And credit card numbers are easy to use in fraud. Right. This is like one step away from legal tender. But if you think about and the flip side of that is that retail organizations process the largest amount of that sort of stuff. Credit cards are going in and out of their environment all day long, right? And if you look at other kinds of industries, especially really, really heavily regulated ones like finance, like CPAs, like law firms, they don't tend to get hit with these kinds of web exploits that are just harvesting this sort of thing. And so what we saw was the more easily saleable for fraud the data was, the less likely they were to see ransomware and the more likely they were to see a Magecart style attack. And so that was the key that helped us understand ransomware is not like a denial of service attack. And that's how I used to think about it. Like when I first came into the field and I was first learning about ransomware, I was like, functionally speaking, this is an availability hit. And we're going to treat it like an availability hit. And so we're going to approach this from a business continuity standpoint. And increasingly now, I'm of the mind that this is another way to sell data that is kind of a pain to use for a fraud campaign. Doesn't mean you can't do it, because there are people out there that will enrich and trade and move around data that you would think are completely useless, people will find a way to use that for fraud for sure. But so the what we saw last year was, if we think about ransomware as a monetization alternative to fraud, and we think that all the organizations that have money that are hard to sell are going to be hit this way, that's actually consistent with what we saw this past year. The part that I didn't get right was I was thinking that the fraud pipeline was going to dry up and we were going to sort of stop seeing the use of exfiltrated data in fraud purposes. And that was not correct, actually. And so one of the things that we had to sort of correct in our predictions for this report that we just published was that the demand for exfiltrated data instead of or in addition to a ransom monetization, that grew a lot. And so exfiltration is back. Lots of people are having their data stolen, and the demand for fraud and the fraud pipeline turned out to be a lot deeper than I thought. And so what it looks like to us now is that basically you're looking at lots and lots of options for the attack. But in terms of the cash out, the monetization, you're either looking at ransoming it back or you're looking at fraud.
And then in the top two instances, finance and healthcare with the access attacks, the fraud occurs when you could sell then those usernames and passwords out to then infiltrate and then let them do whatever they do after that.
Yep. And the stolen data can have sort of like all kinds of lives once it's stolen from an environment, right? And so it's like, if you steal an email inbox, that might be sold off to somebody who's just going to use that for more phishing attempts. Yep. Or somebody else might mine that for IP and then sell IP around or use it for industrial espionage. Or they might just hunt that for sensitive information and say, well, a lot of people keep sensitive information in their email inbox and use it sort of like a low quality cloud storage. I mean, I think we all kind of do that, right? And so once the data is exfiltrated, folks will sort of mine it for whatever they think is useful, and it'll have many lives after that. But the flip side of that is that you can see every sector. So this sort of like federal blue color, I guess, for lack of I don't know, I'm not a color person, but these are the malware infections. You can see that almost every single sector in 2021 was pretty heavily hit by malware, and some of it was ransomware. Some of it didn't even bother to go for the encryption technique, and they just exfiltrated data, didn't even bother with the ransom, which I think is fascinating.
Wow. Well, we talked, I mean, we're coming up on time already. We talked about sort of the methods and the means, no, not the means, the methods. I don't know. I said something in the promo, the motivations and methods. Mm-hmm. What about some of the mitigations for these types of attacks? And I know we've joked before, we've had half-hour conversations about just do all the basics, baby, and you should be all right. So
yeah, we try to write about those on F5 Labs too, and we try to be as practical as we can without getting too specific, because we can't cover every type of technology. But we have written things, and we've got some more stuff coming about like just do backups. Well, do 3-2-1 backups where you've got 3 copies in 2 different places, and and where you try to get one that's air gapped away, so that at least if you're getting, encrypted, it's not getting encrypted along with it. Network segmentation. I'm an old security guy. I've been at this for decades, and like network segmentation kind of is something that sort of like fell by the wayside in modern times, but now it's kind of come back in the cloud world where you can actually do a lot more segmentation just by, running some quick command codes. But the more you can contain that malware to where it is and keep it from spreading around, I think is a really powerful thing. It's worth exploring.
Yeah, and I guess it's somewhat different too, right? With the log4j stuff, it's in a lot of ways it's like keep your systems patched and keep it patched, and you should be okay. But with these, there's even additional things you'll need to do to stop people.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, a lot of the stuff is coming in with phishing, so the user is the one that needs patching, but. I mean, it's hard because they're really trying to trick them. So it's an escalation too. So the less power you can give to a user, the better, so that they don't take out the whole network when they get infected with malware. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm there's so much that we could say here, and I sort of feel like ransomware is such a hard thing to protect against because there are so many different ways that it can manifest. But Just on the subject of backups, I mean, I got my feet wet under Ray a long time ago in ops, and Ray was the one that taught me that your backup isn't valid until you've tested your recovery.
Yeah.
Right. So like just because you got taped somewhere or just because you have a hard drive in a safe doesn't actually mean you have a functional backup until you've actually run through your recovery process and you know that it all works and you know that you know what to do. Right.
And you know how long it takes. Sometimes
right.
it can take weeks.
Yeah. And I actually just heard from somebody else outside of F5 in a security briefing last week that there are organizations that are choosing to pay the ransom. No, sorry. That's the reverse, actually. There are organizations that are paying the ransom and they're finding that the time to decrypt their encrypted data is so long that it still makes sense for them to recover from their backup. So that's actually the exact reverse. The point is here, whichever way you go, whether you're decrypting your encrypted stuff in place or you're choosing to recover, it's not going to be a 5-minute job. It's going to be a big deal, right? And so what that in turn means is if there's anything you can do to harden your environment and prevent that encryption from happening in the first place, you should do it because it's not going to be cheap or painless if everything sort of goes to its final conclusion. That's in terms of encryption.
Well, right, too. And it's probably best to test run the backup and restore, when you're a little calmer and clearer thinking rather than, when everyone is screaming with their hair on fire. Let's pull in some of our comments. I'm sorry I neglected you out there, Daniel, way back in the beginning. Good to see you. Thanks, Boo, for all your help on the back end. Hey, fellas, look who else showed up. Mr. Wagnon, love you. Hope you're doing well out there. Let's see who else we got. Oh, and there was some talking about a DeLorean. I guess, everybody's into time travel or the potential of time travel these days. Speaking of, I think I saw recently that that they're going to build a new electric DeLorean. Plug it in and
will it run on Lightning or Mr. Fusion?
Off you go.
Is it still going to have a stainless steel body?
I'm not sure. It was just, how like stuff passes through on Twitter and it sort of catches your eye. And then when you go back to look for it, it's disappeared the whole time. And then Jason's got Time Cop is his favorite time travel movie. Wow. Yeah. Cool. Well, I don't know. I don't have any items in here that I could time travel with, except maybe a couple of those old Blackberries, but that's more nostalgia than time travel. Oh, what a fun show. It's always good having you guys on. I always learn so much. So as we wrap this up, do you have any final words about either the application protection report or anything else you might like to talk about as we close this show today?
Should I say my goodbyes? It's my last F5 show for now.
Well, that's certainly your prerogative. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you did, we're sad to see that Ray will be moving on shortly. This will be his last security. Well, I don't want to say
I want to come back as a guest.
So. Yeah, so we'll just leave it the whole see you laters rather than
there you go.
Yeah, I definitely love you guys and I love the team. I'm gonna miss everybody.
And you'll still have a shirt to wear when you come on camera.
I know. I always have the shirt is always on the side for when I'm ready to give it to.
So that'll be cool.
Get my F5 shirt on. I have a lot of F5 material actually.
Plenty. How about you, Sander? What do you want to say as we close out this second Tuesday of the month on Security Sidebar?
Well, I was just sitting here thinking about all the other stuff in that report that we still have to talk about. So if folks are up for it and if it is useful to folks, then I think probably next month we should do the same thing and to keep sort of mining out conclusions because there's a ton in there that we didn't get to. But if folks are bored of the APR, we can also talk about other stuff. And Malcolm will be back next week, and he and I have been talking over some sort of interesting things for some future research. So I would say let us know in the comments if you guys want to talk APR, and if you want to know about other stuff, we'll talk about other stuff.
Well, it's a pretty thick report, so just kind of glossing over it in, what do we do, like 23 minutes after our time travel
all the cloud stuff. You haven't even gotten all the cloud
stuff. Justice. Yeah. So Sweet.
Yeah, in fact, the cloud stuff is really fascinating. There's a little bit less data there, but some really, really weird findings. So maybe that's the topic for next month.
Cool. We'll hit it then. All right. So coming up, let me see if I can find my banners. I don't have my banners up. So coming up this Thursday, 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 a.m. Pacific, Jason and Boo will be kicking off. Well, we actually kicked off Microservices Month last Thursday, but this coming Thursday in 2 days' time, they're going to do Lab 1, how they're going through the Nginx, I believe it's a Kubernetes labs. Boo's going to set it up, and Jason's going to come in and go through the lab without any practice just to see how easy and nice it is. Then the following Tuesday, Jason has his core, as you can see on screen, talking about the modern application reference architecture. And then the following Thursday, on the 17th, we're going to do Lab 2. So when you see what happens on Lab 1 with Boo in the setup and Jason with the work through, they're just going to switch roles on Thursday, the 17th, where Jason will set it up and Boo will knock it down. So check those out. Again, we broadcast out through YouTube and LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. So if you watch this on any of those, thanks for joining us today. And with that, for Sander and Ray, I'm Peter, and we're with F5. Thanks for watching.
Take care.
This week on Dev Central Connects, we're learning to fly with labs that sing. Ba-na-na-na. Come on down for the learning thing. Thursday, March 10th, 9:30 a.m. Come on down as Jason and Boo start the first Nginx lab. It's Microservices Month. Boo's going to set it up, and Jason's going to try to complete the lab. No hints involved. Join us Thursday, March 10th, 9:30 a.m. as we continue Microservices Month. The link in the description sets your reminder. Dev Central Connects is live every Thursday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific. Come on and learn to fly. Oh, that was off.